I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Melyssa Haffaf, who is with us from Georgetown University, where she's the director of the Gender and Justice Initiative, and where she also teaches women and gender studies courses. She has a bachelor's degree in sociology and philosophy from the Sorbonne, Paris, and a doctorate in literary, cultural and linguistic studies, so an interesting kind of mix of disciplines there, and with a focus on gender, which she had from the University of Miami, I think. Your dissertation, Melyssa's dissertation, was on shifting masculinities from North Africa, examining literary and discourse representations of masculinity in post-colonial Algeria, Egypt and Morocco. Kind of more broadly, Dr. Haffaf's research relates to North African cultural production, Islamic studies, gender studies, feminist theory and practice, and decolonial and racial theory. And I think today you'll be presenting Masculinities on the Move, the case of post-colonial Algeria. So Melyssa, over to you, we're all ready, I think.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very honored to present at UCC, although I'm all the way in DC. I wish I could have visited your wonderful campus over there in Ireland, and inshallah that will happen in the future. Thank you for the Department of Study of Religions and for Dr. Capallo and Dr. DeSondi for inviting me and organizing this talk today. So today I will try to basically speak about Algeria. So as it was just previously said, I mainly work on countries around the Mediterranean and particularly North African countries, Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt, Tunisia. But today I wanted to speak particularly about the case of Algeria. Not only it's because it's my beautiful and cherished country. I may be biased a little bit, but also because I'd like to shine light on a recent social movement that has unfolded in 2019 that we have entitled the Hirak, which literally means movement, which has been ignited by the youth and particularly young Algerians and students to demand basically all what usually social movements demand: justice, democratic system, the rule of law, and ultimately the dismantlement of the system that has been put in place since 1962, since the independence of Algeria. So what I'd like to do today, I will present. So bear with me as I try to summarize, I guess, or do a broad review of 70 years of history of Algerian colonial and post-colonial history. And my goal here is not to get into the details, but rather sort of show the process through which masculinity has been shaped and represented within Algerian context, but also look at what's happening now. So the agenda for today. First, I will do setting up the framework by sharing a few concepts and ideas, looking into creating the connection between masculinity and nation, and body, and look at some terminology too. Second, I will do a brief overview of Algerian post-colonial history. And finally, I will explore Algerian masculinities from independence to the light 2019 Hirak movement. So why masculinity? I've been basically interested in this topic for a number of years now, and a lot of times I hear, but why would you study men, especially when it comes to the North African context? And I'd like to first share that it's not really different from studying men in other places, knowing that patriarchy and this sort of larger global patriarchy oppresses the same way, and particularly women, but also men who do not fit to the hegemonic model of masculinity. So in that sense, I just thought the Algerian context was interesting, but not because Arab men, quote unquote, North African men, Muslim men are more problematic than other men. So I just wanted to sort of debunk that myth that I get to have. I do at least get a lot of comments when I say that I work on that particular reason. I often get the of course, sort of implying that North African men are more macho than the rest. But we see that violence against women is happening everywhere, unfortunately. So another aspect in why studying masculinity is that actually we see that men are rarely conceived as a gendered subject, and let alone studied as such. And if any of the study we will find about men, it will mainly concern what they've achieved rather than the way they have experienced the world. So my research also tries to address a sort of a lack in that field of study. And masculinity, unlike other categories of gender, always seems self-evident. It's basically, it's commonly framed, and again, here I'm being purposely general, as being a product of nature, testosterone. It's just the opposite of femininity. Usually the qualities that we associate with it are strength, to be brave, assertive, courageous, rational, emotionless, and so on. Another aspect too is that the masculinity actually is only questioned. We find out in a lot of contexts that only we get to question it only when it's excessive. Sort of, there's a case of hyper masculinity, and most likely when there is a lack of masculinity. And we can talk also about sort of processes or what we call emasculation. But here, I'd like to suggest that masculinity should be first used in the plural, because there's no such thing as masculinity. It doesn't exist. There's so many expressions of masculinity, and I think it should be studied as a diverse and complex phenomena. And we see in society there's so many different ways in which people present themselves, identify themselves, and that's not just in the case of Algeria, but even more so in some of the countries that we hear right now, which shows us clearly that it is not a static or a natural phenomenon. As we see throughout history, men have not always looked the same, presented the same, and we see it constantly moving. Terminology. So just to be clear here, I prefer the use of the word masculinity, masculinities, as it implies more of a instability, a process, a complexity, and which is drawn from the feminist and queer theory tradition, rather than manhood or male identity, which would imply more of an essence, natural ways in which men are in their genes. So there's just wanted to clarify that, why the term masculinity instead of identity. Now I'd like to introduce a couple of concepts and sort of starting to create a link between what has masculinity to do with nation and the body, actually, and the male body. That again, the body is a complex entity. It's a physical entity, but it is yet very complex to define, as we cannot really define the body outside of any cultural influence. All of our bodies have received some kind of cultural influence in the way we see them, we care for them, we perceive other bodies. We have all kinds of discourse in society that influences that. And in that sense, the body becomes a vessel through which masculinity is constructed. Institutions and ideology, for various reasons, will depend on corporality to function efficiently. Here I just give a few examples: capitalism, military, nation, they need certain types of body in order to carry out the project. So in that sense, we have to continue to push for a certain ideal. And I think the best or the most striking example will be the military body, which I will give more details further. But we see also that the male body is very much discussed and used in culture through images, myths, all kinds of types of discourse, sports, advertising, the arts, medicine, the law, religion. Everyone has, or every field has, a type of discourse that they will have around the body, may it be male or female. And each discourse will sort of impose an idea of what the body should be or what the body is supposed to be. In the case of masculinity, we can see what the type of, let's say, the sports industry, the kind of body and image that they will promote. We will also see, for example, especially in the past 50 years and the acceleration of capitalism, which we see a push for muscular bodies, even particularly in the West, where sort of a hyper masculine muscular body is now the ideal body, which was not necessarily the case 60 years ago. We've even seen it appear in the little toys, such as those action figures, where they used to be sort of regular men, and now they have turned into these big, giant, extremely muscular men. So that also pushes, obviously, a whole industry of, going to the gym, getting a membership. Another one is eating meat, protein has been pushed very much in advertising and to the forefront, and as being also connected to a certain masculinity or superior masculinity. And here for the military and masculinity body, which is sort of the peak of what we deem to see as masculine in society. And it's interesting because the military body is so easy to read. There's nothing you can read outside of military, and this is why it is designed in that sense: short haircut, uniform, healthy, ideally, in order to wage wars. You prefer to have "quote unquote" healthy bodies or muscular bodies. And it does allow to provide a very stable meaning to masculinity. And I will not get into that, but again, what we often see is that the masculine body is not allowed to be represented, projected outside of it being healthy. And actually, the only body that mainstream culture will tolerate as being wounded would be perhaps the military body after fighting for the honor of the nation. And even then, we see the ways in which veterans are treated and all types of PTSD that comes with it, which I will not get into today, but that's something to, and obviously I'm happy to speak about it afterwards. Here, I'd like to then continue on to sort of create the connection between nation and masculinity, and basically how is the nation masculinized or how is masculinity nationalized. And actually, what we see is that men overwhelmingly in the world are leaders. We only see, I think, less than 2% of presidents and I guess prime ministers who are women, which seems clearly patriarchy is happening everywhere. And in that sense, we create the nation, and the leader becomes the extension of what the nation is supposed to be. And we even see cases of anxiety if we feel that the gender is not ideal. And I think one of a striking example is the last term of President Donald Trump, after Obama, which was, there was definitely in the discourse around his campaign and in the public discourse in general, this idea that America has become, had become some type of emasculated or weak, and it was time to bring it back and make it great again and all of that. And we saw the same thing with Reagan after Carter. So there is that how we, the connections between the leader and what we see of the nation being masculine enough or not. And finally, I'd like to share a concept that is has been elaborated by R.W. Connell, who is one of the pioneers in terms of masculinity studies, which is the concept of hegemonic masculinity, which she draws from the Gramsci's theory of hegemonic culture, and this idea of having, she basically realizes that there is, although she works on the Western context, we can certainly see through the ways in which patriarchy works that such categorization works, and the idea of basically having one model in society that is deemed to be the ideal model, the dominant model, and by doing so it implies oppressing others that are outside of this masculinity. I'm just trying to see if I would want, but I guess I will read you a quote by R.W. Connell, where she defines hegemonic masculinity is defined as a practice that legitimizes men's dominant power in society and justifies the subordination of the common male population and women and other marginalized ways of being a man. Conceptually, hegemonic masculinity proposed to explain how and why men maintain dominant social roles over women and other gender identities which are perceived feminine in any given society. So this is a concept that we'll be using throughout this presentation. Now on to the second part, which is basically Algeria. I'm just looking at time to see how I'm doing. And which is really difficult to, so again, bear with me. I am not intending to give any sort of in-depth history of Algeria. I'm definitely glossing over a lot of important things, but I just want to give a sort of a brief short story.
Melyssa, sorry, were you sharing your slides? Because we can't see any slides at the moment. Did you want to share them?
I've been sharing my, is this really happening? I've been sharing I haven't been sharing anything for this so far. Wait.
Okay. I mean, it's been wonderful. It's been easy to follow, so don't worry that the slides were not there.
Okay, because I am absolutely fine. Clearly, I am not familiar with this. Okay, is that it? Yes. Can you see my screen now?
Now we can, yes. Yeah.
Oh my God. So we had all these slides, but it's okay. Great. It's not the quote unquote most important.
It's very supportive to see that you've had problems with it, because when I have problems, I think, oh my God, I must be so inadequate. So I'm glad, I'm not glad, but it's happened. It certainly happened to me.
We are all having technology issues, and somehow we've been doing it for a year, and yet I still forget to unmute myself. All these things happen, right? So now the presentation. I'm glad. Thank you so much for noticing this. So basically now onto Algeria. I would like to do just a brief sort of overview of the French colonialism, which has been extremely brutal, and it was basically continuous massacre from 1830 to 1962, where Algeria finally got its independence. And it started with what ironically was called pacification campaigns, which were, massacres to take control of Algeria. And the colonial and exploitative, economic exploitative project was disguised as a civilizing mission. And I'm sure if you know about colonialism in general, but particularly the French colonialism in Africa. That was what has been put forward in order to carry out the project. It led to the extermination of a third of the population. It is estimated that the Algerian population was around 3 million at that time, and 1 million were killed in the aftermath. And obviously, as you know, usually colonization comes with erasure of experiences, but also, destructions of heritage, of buildings, all kinds of painful and harmful things that France has done all throughout. And it was also a profound and unique experience compared to the other countries that France colonized, because starting in 1848, Algeria is actually integrated into France, or becomes an extension of the metropolitan France. And we create 3 departments, and we also sent French people to live in Algeria, the same way the what is that called? The UK has done with Australia, for example. So that would be sort of a similar comparison. So some people, all kinds of people were sent out, but a lot of them were criminals, and were sent as punishment to Algeria. And the Algerians lived under what we call the Code de l'Indigènes, which was a different code, which clearly basically made Algerian citizens second-class citizens compared to their white French counterparts, as well as the Jewish Algerians, which in 1856, if I'm not mistaken, with the Décret Crémieux, Napoleon actually integrated the Jews of Algeria into Frenchness, into French citizenship, which it's a whole other conversation, but which clearly created, it was just basically, to summarize, it was divide to conquer, because it had seen at that time from the Muslim Algerians as sort of a betrayal from their Jewish fellows, knowing that they were all North Africans there for hundreds of years together. So there's just a few important aspects of the ways in which the Algerian colonization was very specific, or a special experience in that sense, and not in any positive way. And therefore, we produce this sort of what I call the production of Indigènes, but really that's what they used to call the Muslim Algerians, or the Arabs, although not all the populations were identifying as Arabs. And so through that process, we both racialize the colonial subject as well as gender it, and create some sort of mystical and limited depictions of what Algerian men were or supposed to be, and same thing with women. I am sure you've all heard of the work of Edward Said, Orientalism, where he does an incredible work at looking at this cultural production from the West that creates the East through the Western gaze. So in this case, Algerian men as deemed and seemed and perceived as both submissive and savages to be tamed. Women are also not escaping in this essentialization. They were seen as submissive, needed to be liberated from the French, which is also something that is deeply connected to what is currently happening in France, or has been happening in France, with the French Algerians, and the ways in which legislations and all kinds of Islamophobic campaigns have been launched against the Muslim French, which I'm also very happy to talk about in the Q&A if we want to take it to the other side. But it's definitely rooted in this experience of the ways in which the French were obsessed with unveiling Algerian women already in the 19th century. And so Assia Jabbar, which I would like to mention here, who is a very important Algerian writer, feminist writer, who wrote in Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement, which actually is women of Algiers in their apartment, where she basically takes this 19th century painting by Eugène Delacroix, a very important romantic and orientalist painter of the 19th century, who had only spent 3 days in Algiers, but then comes back to Paris and decides to paint a whole series of Algerian people, and particularly women. And she basically writes this book by calling him out on his most likely lie, because there was probably no way that a French white man of that time could have penetrated into Algerian homes, and let alone the hammam or the harem or some of those very intimate spaces. So there was also this sort of a whole part of the production of the imagery of the North Africa that was fantasized, purely fantasized by these European painters and writers, even, who created all kinds of stories, because it's also Flaubert. There's a whole literature that goes with it. We see here another tableau by Delacroix, Arabs of Oran, and a lot of times men are just being depicted as doing nothing, lazy, laying down, or singing or playing some flute. So this is Assia Jabbar and France Fanon, also, who I was mentioning earlier, who was actually an Algerian revolutionary, but also a psychiatrist, an important, very important critical race theorist, and who also became the theorist for the liberation movement, who talks about in Algeria Unveiled, Studies in a Dying Colonialism, about the unveiling of Muslim women that from the French perspective would support the Western penetration into native society, which we see tropes existing up to today in 2021 France, actually, in France. But then, although this colonization and happening is extremely brutal, extremely harmful, the resistance is going all throughout, and I think it's everywhere, actually. I think a lot of social movements, we just see the moment where we decide that this was the moment as the war or the revolution, but really we can appreciate that it is usually a long trajectory that gets to a culminating point that really subverts everything. And in the case of Algeria, many campaigns on the Algerian side trying to resist the French colonization. And actually, some parts of Algeria were not colonized all in 1830. It took decades to colonize the entire territory, per se. And here I'd like to mention the Sétif massacre, which happened in May 8th, 1945, which was a terrible situation, because May 8th, 1945, in Paris, the Nazis are defeated. So we are celebrating the end of World War II. And in Algiers, or at least in Algeria, in Sétif, the same is happening. There's some défilé or sort of marches and of celebrating that, and Muslim Algerians also come out, and by celebrating the World War II and the defeat on the Nazis, Algerians were also hoping to get finally their independence, which was a project was trying to be carried out after World War I and World War II, because Algerians, like all of the other colonized subjects, were fighting in those world wars and were sent to fight against the Germans. And even after World War II, were sent to fight against Vietnamese in the Indochina War that France lost. So although it was a peaceful protest, it was received with extreme violence from the French police in Algeria, and we talk about between 6,000 to 30,000 Algerians were killed during those days. And Kateb Yassine, who is one of the most prominent and very important Algerian writer, was actually a student at that time who participated into the protest, was arrested. And this was such a traumatic and pivotal moment for his life and his actual literary production, where he starts really writing about this colonial condition and how to get out of it by writing a poem called Nejma ou le couteau, then a very famous novel that turned into a play. And he's part of a generation of writers and thinkers who were trying to put some words and sense to that experience and quite try to think about something possible after. And finally, the revolution arrives, a radical promise. So as I was saying, the anti-colonial consciousness and resistance is present all along. But then obviously the World War II, and particularly the massacre of Sétif, was a pivotal moment that sort of showed some of the Algerians, at least, that perhaps this struggle could not be happening if it wouldn't become an armed struggle. And unfortunately, this is when the French authorities started to pay attention. So the FLN, which is the Liberation National Front, mobilized its youth and created an army of liberation, and in a few years, everybody was on board, including European sort of white Christian French people who fought alongside the Muslims. So it was obviously an overwhelmingly majority of Muslim Algerians, but there were also such as Frantz Fanon or even Maurice Audin, and some who were actually assassinated by the French authorities. The Algerian diaspora also was instrumental in making this revolution happen, as a lot of Algerians have fought in the world wars, such as my grandfather in World War I, and then were called again to rebuild France as immigrant workers. And there already they had started to sort of organize through labor unions and things like that, and also collecting funds and all kinds of ways to help the struggle back in Algeria. Also, an important aspect of this war, but that happened all throughout the French colonization, is the torture that we barely start to excavate. The President François Macron has finally, a few weeks ago, recognized that France had in fact assassinated a very important leader of the FLN, Ali Boumengel, when they would pretend that he had committed suicide. A lot of times they would throw them out of buildings or rooftops and pretend that they had killed themselves. I'm sorry, it's very, very painful and deep. And after this, we see a very massive anti-colonial literary production during and after, which Kateb Yassine is part of, and Mohamed Dib and many other writers. Here are a few images of women, people, young people fighting for their liberation, so to speak. In 1962, again, I'm fast forwarding because this is there's too many details and layers to talk about, but Algeria is finally independent, and what we call the Democratic and Popular Republic of Algeria is born. And the FLN, the Liberation Party, becomes the only ruling party, and we embrace sort of a socialist economic system and model, as it is times of Cold War, and the Algeria sided with the Russians or the USSR at that time. We also start to identify as an Arab nation, which was problematic in many ways, and we see it up to today, because a lot of the indigenous populations who have not necessarily identified as Arabs, including myself, the Amazigh people, the indigenous people of North Africa, which we call the Berbers. The Romans called us barbarians, but really it's the Amazigh people who have been there for thousands of years and speak another language, have been Islamized with the Arab conquest, as well as sort of we're a hybrid of all of these layers of invasions, but yet don't necessarily ethnically identify. So Algeria creates this new project of a socialist Arab nation, but although it starts working for a little while, it doesn't, after a decade or so, we can see the disenchantment of the revolution. And here we see the establishment going from the Indigènes, sort of violated by the colonial empire and power. We see the rise of the war hero, obviously after this incredible revolution that was fought for 8 long years. We talk about 1 million Algerians dying. So there's all these martyrs of the revolution, but also the mujahideen, those who have the veterans basically of the war. And they're starting to be extremely celebrated in every sort of medium possible. We have visual representation, patriotic songs, popular tales, monuments, as I show here. In the school programs, that's pretty much all we talk about, posters, and all state-produced. And all this discourse praise this ideal man who incarnates power, dominance, pride. He liberated Algeria. He regained the lost pride during all of this time of colonial oppression. And we also delimited style by his values, the bodily gestures, his behavior. And that is the only way you can be an Algerian man, if you incarnate. And this is coming, actually, this one picture at the top is coming from the movie, The Battle of Algiers, which I highly recommend, which came out in 1966 and was right after the Algerian War ended. And most of the actors are actually not actors. They're simply Algerians who had participated into the revolution. And it's basically a master class in police brutality. It's an interesting film because it has been used for various projects, but initially it was a model to show other people who wanted to get liberated, the ways in which the state operates and how we can counter the state. And for example, the Black Panthers it used to be a requirement to watch the Battle of Algiers in order to be a part of the Black Panthers party in the United States, and which the Black Panthers then comes to Algiers. There's a whole connection between the sort of revolutionary Algerian movement and the ways in which it connects to other people who wanted to be liberated. But then later on, the Battle of Algiers is also used by military to combat, to establish dictatorships, to train people, to show the techniques of tortures, because the movie showcases that. And unfortunately, we even used it during this war on terror, which is still happening after 9/11, and to sort of show how you tame those terrorists. So that's a whole other conversation, but I absolutely recommend the film. So this is the model to be followed after 62, and sort of still is. These statues, this sort of Algerian hero is to be seen everywhere until today. But unfortunately, the oil drop prices in the 70s, plus the other factors of sort of the failure of this post-colonial government, who quickly turned into a boys' club that was quite corrupted, and then like in a lot of places, unfortunately. And I have to also say that women, although we're being instrumental in the revolution, as also taking arms, not just sort of, because women are always instrumental, by the way, but in this case, they were really taking all roles to also be combatant on the field. As soon as 1962 arrives, they're sort of pushed out of the political scene, political spaces. And I think, in my opinion, is one of the reasons why Algeria failed to materialize these revolutionary ideals. And so we see uprisings in 1980s where we see the youth and students sort of coming out on the street and asking for all of the basic economic justice and all the ideals promoted in 1962. Unfortunately, this time it's the Algerian independent states who becomes this oppressor, and the military is sent out on the streets and kills a few hundred people, which was extremely traumatic. And here, basically during this protest, and one of the big demands was to allow multipartism, because Algeria had only one party, the FLN. So we did have a parliament, but nobody was really debating anything because everybody was from the same party. So finally, the multipartism is allowed by a change in the constitution, and we see the rise of an Islamic or brotherhood called the FIS, the Islamic Salvation Front, rise almost overnight. I think, again, it was a process. There's a lot of factors dealing also with the education system, but people were not expecting them to win the first municipal election. They won more than 50% of the votes, and they were really good at basically targeting the youth, and particularly men, and offering a mobilizing project. And in this sense, they sort of start creating a new type of masculinity that bases its concept on the martyr hero, but then saying, hey, look, those in the FLN in power, the elite, the ruling elite, the corrupted ruling elite, is clearly socialists, which they didn't want to associate themselves. They thought it was a foreign and Western concept, and obviously not Muslim enough and too Westernized. They want to continue the French project. That's basically sort of some of the arguments they advanced to convince these young men to join them. And it works, unfortunately, and again, economic despair will be the perfect context for that. And they finally sell this idea that you can get this hero status that you were promised since you were born, in all of these depictions of what the Algerian man is supposed to be. Unfortunately, follows a decade of violence, of more violence. This time it's Algerians against Algerians, or Algerians who joined these now newly formed armed groups who are fighting the Algerian state and the Algerian army. And although initially their target was the Algerian state, the project starts going a little bit further, and they start killing anything that they deem not Islamic enough or Muslim enough, because that doesn't mean anything, Muslim enough. And artists, university professors, journalists. Algeria is probably one of the countries that lost the most journalists in the past, in that time or ever, unfortunately, because they were trying to cover all of these crimes that these groups were doing or perpetrating. And here, finally, I'd like to, I'm already running out of time, but I will add a couple of minutes. Here is another important writer, Yasmina Khadra, who actually has a woman's name because he was, interestingly enough, part of the Algerian army during that time. And he was part of what we call the literature of urgency and starting to document and write during the unfolding of that Black decade. And one book in particular is called Wolf Dreams, À quoi rêvent les loups, where he follows the quest of this young Algerian man who wants to be an actor and turns out to become a murderer, and joins the Brotherhood, and obviously, so it's a very interesting ways to understand from really the subjective perspective and not just look at it of like, oh, here are just a bunch of crazy people. Obviously, it's way more complicated than that, but he allows to make sense to this experience and this shock that Algeria had to experience. And we talk about 200,000 Algerian dying. It's actually way more than that. Same thing. All of these numbers are always estimates because depending who is saying what. So, and in this case, we can really see the shift happening in this novel of going from one type of masculinity to another, so to speak. And finally, 1 minute, in the past, so in February 2019, a new movement started. And actually, if you are familiar with this, what we called Arab Springs, in 2011 in Tunisia and then in Egypt and other places, Algeria did not take part of it. And it didn't take part of it. And a lot of people were questioning that at that time because we have a different temporality. We've had the revolution that was extremely deep and traumatic. And then we have another, I guess, fall in October 88, which was followed then by a whole civil war. And then it takes us another 20 years to come back on the streets and the youth to say, we are done. Basically, the president Bouteflika, who was in power for already 20 years, wanted to run for a 5th term. And this is when people were like, not anymore. And particularly young people who only had one president at that time. So they're all raised with the Algerian war hero, because by the way, the Black decade is still not really, there's no work on memory that has really been done. It's not really taught in school. So we're still sort of on the 1962 ideal in terms of reference or official discourse of state masculinity, sponsored masculinity. And here I just want to show you some of the signs actually, which were, we called it also the Révolution du Sourire, or the Smile Revolution, because it was a very Pacific movement. The same determination as, I guess, the Revolution for Independence, except that the means here are no violence whatsoever. Because we know what the army was capable of doing in the late 80s, and it's just also to try to create something very different in terms of the tactics of moving a social project and social movement forward. So here it says, we don't need you, don't worry, we can be better. So that's talking to the intelligentsia or the establishments, the system we want to get out. Here they talk about the expiration date. So basically it was, the regime was made on July 5th, 62, and now it's time for its expiration has arrived on 2019, February 22nd. People connected, system disconnected. This young person says, I'm 20 years old and I've only known you, talking about the president who has been there for 20 years. Here's just literally trolling the president. Love the way you lie. Not sure if Algeria or Bollywood, which is also an interesting reference here because I'm now using Hollywood, and Algeria has a whole connection with the Bollywood film industry, which I will not get into now. Here they ask, we demand a radical change of system, not a change of puppets, which is, yeah, they've been sort of switching people around, hoping that it will do it. Here we see a young person harboring notre histoire, on l'écrira nous-mêmes. Our history, will write it ourselves. And here it's pacifist protest, an Algerian brand, basically, on November 2019. I feel that I forgot something, but I don't know what. I think that's it for now. There's so much.
Thank you so much for that. That was an incredible. I mean, you covered so much ground, so it's forgivable that you took a little bit more time to cover that for us.
Yeah,
really thorough background.
That made some sense. I tried to, a crash course on masculinities / post-colonial Algeria.
Thank you. So if anybody has a question, can you please pop your hand up and I'll monitor the chat there. One's come immediately straight away. Let's go to Donal. Do you want to turn your mic on, Donal, and ask your question?
Yeah. Hey, Melyssa, that was really, really interesting. Thanks so much. I wanted to just ask you a little bit about what you were saying at the end there about this kind of shift that you saw during the Hirak. And I just thought it was interesting myself in following the coverage that there was this kind of tension between, on the one hand, you know, a very kind of masculinist critique of the ruling class. So, you know, a lot of stuff about Bouteflika being, you know, basically in a vegetative state, and all of the ruling class being not real men because they were so old and lacking virility. And then on the other hand, this kind of new discourse, you know, connected to the fact that the protesters would clean the streets themselves after the events, to kind of refute that idea that young men in particular were, you know, slobby and kind of an underclass that had always been promoted by the regime. So I was wondering if you wanted to say just something about the kind of competing new ideas of masculinity that emerged during the Iraq.
Thank you. Absolutely, that's a very good point that you make. And actually, I wanted to cover, but it's so much to cover. Basically, yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting to see this sort of new generation. Even myself, I remember having conversations with friends months before the movement started, and me arguing that I don't see anything really happening anytime soon. Next thing you know, it's happening. And remember one of my friends telling me, no, I don't think you're really connected with the new generation. And it's true, because my generation, we lived through the Black Decade. We were all traumatized by this terrorism. So we're not sure we want to take it again on the street and do all of these things and be received that way. So this new generation, as I was saying, they've only known Bouteflika, and they are taught from the beginning in the school, because the school programs are very, very clear about what type of masculinity and what type of imagery we push towards, like what Algeria is and what to be an Algerian man particularly is. And here we see this 20 years old who are completely breaking away from this whole modernity versus tradition, which is always that we sort of frame anything that has to do with these countries, where they're completely embracing both. They will be listening to hip hop and house music, and then go to their Juma prayer, and then maybe also smoke a joint later on. And it's not, nothing is incompatible. It's just this post-colonial experience. And absolutely the ways in which these young men are trying to shape something completely different. It's been extremely inclusive, and like the Black Decade and the Muslim Brotherhood, here we're talking to women too. So everybody's on the streets together. I was actually in Algeria in December 2019 and earlier last year, and got to protest. I went to 3 different ones, and it was incredible to see everybody together. And it's such a different, and I hadn't even felt that way for so many years in Algeria. And seeing the young people, when I used to feel like I would be harassed on the street, it was no, oh, hi, how are you doing? Very, very, and I think the movement completely gave this sort of new, sort of people are breathing again. And wanting to shape something that's completely outside of the cliches, the habitual cliches about them that the government or the elite may have put on them, but also the West, the East. We're always sort of constantly, because we are looking to Saudi Arabia for certain things, and then it's the colonizers that are in front of us, and then it's the rest of Africa. And here where I think we're trying to sort of embrace all that we are. If that.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I can't see any other hands at the moment. Okay, Adele.
Yeah, my name is Edel. I work in applied social studies, so I kind of feel like I'm, you know, I don't work in the religions department, but I was very interested in the topic. And as I'm listening to you, even though as Irish people we have a lot to thank our nearest neighbour in relation to employment. You know, a lot of Irish people work in England and are, you know, like can, you know, go through the ranks and be very well, I suppose, you know, very well received and very well valued. We also have a colonial history, and there's one writing now, I don't know the source of it, but there was an old pictorial book. So when you started to show pictorial books, it jogged my memory. And there's an old pictorial book about old Ireland during the time that we were colonized, and we are described as lazy, you know, kind of stupid, you know, so there was a real depiction of us in a certain way. So it really resonated with the capacity that a colonizer can have in perpetrating an image. And I don't know, I haven't actually connected yet, because I'm needing to think about it a little bit more, what we have had to do since our independence, you know, in the early 20s to move beyond that. But like, it was really a set image. So that's all. It was just a comment, really, not a question. You know, there was so much resonance with the colonial experience, I suppose. So thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Adele.
And thank you for the invitation, the broad invitation within the college. It's really wonderful to be able to access such presentations and discussions. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Melyssa, I have a question actually, and it's kind of off the back there of what Adele was saying, and I happen to have to hand Pierre Bourdieu, the book of Pierre Bourdieu's photography, and as you were describing the depictions of, you know, masculinity in Algeria, I just took a flick through to see how, you know, what you were saying resonated with his photographic eye. And of course, a lot's been written about his depictions of Algerian society at that juncture, you know, in the 50s, I think it's late 50s and early 1960s. So with your kind of post-colonial lens, I wonder, what do you see in his depictions? Because I know there's a lot of masked violence that appears in the images, and so really I'd love to just hear what you think.
Has done such. So Pierre Bourdieu, I will contextualize a little bit. So Pierre Bourdieu is a French sociologist who has done. Initially, he was a philosopher who turned into sociology and became one of the most important sociologists of the 20th century. And he started his work in Algeria, actually. And he wrote, I mean, I haven't mentioned it, but that's definitely in my research. He wrote a book called Masculine Domination, where he did a study with actually my tribe or my ethnic group, the Kabyles, the Amazigh, the Berber of Algeria, and sort of looking at this society as sort of a laboratory to understand patriarchy and the ways in which it had evolved around the Mediterranean, and starts looking into even the vocabulary, anything that is, and which is, we can also even see in a lot of patriarchal societies in our language, where anything that is positive will be associated with masculine, anything that is negative will be associated with feminine. All the domain of the inside of the home will be associated with feminine, and so on. Sort of create, like, highlighting the binaries on between, and the domination. So because that's the thing, it's like that's the issue with the binary, that a lot of times we don't necessarily think about. It's not just creating two different categories, but unfortunately we create two different categories and one of them is better than the other. And this is what happened with the masculine feminine sort of rapport. And Pierre Bourdieu, I think, has done an incredible work in terms of the ways in which he tried to make sense of the Algerian context at that time. And then later on, when he goes back, because then he taught at the University of Algiers. And I'm glad, although there's some of these things that could be questioned again, we can do sort of anachronistic readings, that he was able to collect some of these experiences during the time he was in Algeria in the 1950s and 1960s. I'm not sure if that answers your question. And I don't know why I can't see you. Oh, I guess I can now.
Sorry, images that Pierre Bourdieu was taking. Sorry, did everybody miss all of that? I'm sorry. So what I wanted to say was that, yeah, in particular, his visual representations, which is why I mentioned it in relation to your slides, because you're showing the imagery there. What sense they reproduce the colonial eye, even though he was clearly not intended to do that, because the critique of his photographs is that they actually mask violence with the intention of showing Algerian culture. Sometimes he's masking the violent context within which he was able to capture certain aspects of Algerian culture. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a difficult. I think he was trying to counter the images of the 100+ years of essentialization of what Algerian were, and particularly this fantasy that we created. And there is actually a very famous pictures, for those who don't know, of a woman, an Algerian woman wearing the traditional hayek, which is this white cover that goes sort of it's like basically a big white sheet that we put, that women in Algiers used to put. And he photographed one on scooter in Algeria, which was seen. But again, some of the images felt like he was trying too hard, but then it is the reality of Algeria too. And it's also that difficulty, and that's what Edward Said speaks about in Orientalism and other of his works, of the Oriental becoming Oriental, in that sense of like, by being Orientalized so much, you tend, and there is some elements that are still there that are quote unquote true, but then again, we come in various different shapes, ways of forms, and like all societies, it's always in movement. But then we like to fix Arabs, quote unquote, in a certain time, in a certain category, and we can, I mean, we see it up to these days, the ways in which media covers Muslims in the US, in Europe. We are still, unfortunately, dealing with these cliches and stereotypical images that we have a hard time breaking away from.
Wonderful, thanks, Melissa. Are there any other questions? Anyone waiting with a question? We're actually out of time.
I'm just looking at this
and
now.
I have to go and to MA anthropology class to watch some student presentations. So but anybody, people are welcome to stay in the space and keep discussing with Melissa's presentation if you'd like. But I myself have to leave. I don't know if Aman, if you're still here, or Jenny would take over the reins while I leave to go to the.
I have a class as well, James. So
oh, right.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you so
Dr.
much.
Haffaf.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. If I could suggest we just close, that would be
okay. Great. Well, but another thank you from me. It was absolutely fascinating presentation, really interesting, and sparked that interest there in kind of Algerian, the distinctive Algerian experience of colonialism and its route out of the colonialism. So thank you from everybody from the Study of Religions Department. And yeah.
Thanks, Melissa.
Very much. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Have a beautiful evening. And I hope to see you in Ireland next time.
Absolutely. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.